So welcome to Breakout Session A, AMD Emerging Treatments and Promising Research with Dr. Jeff Williams and Dr. Amin Kherani.
Thank you, everybody. We're going to do something different. It's going to be a tag team. I'm going to ask Jeff questions, and he's going to answer them. It's going to be a first. So we're hoping to talk about emerging research and treatments in macular degeneration, so hopefully you'll find it informative. So Jeff, why don't you help us understand a little bit about the history or the past treatment modalities?
Thank you. This is going to be fun. By the way, if you really get tired of listening to me, just put up your hand and then I know to switch and let him talk for a while. So the answer to that question is we go way back. Nobody put up their hand, so that's good. The history goes way back to the early 60s when lasers were first developed. And so at that time, the only treatment you had was laser. And we've got some pictures to show that, where if you had growing blood vessels in the back of the eye, you could cauterize them by burning them with a laser. And this was a tricky business because you were literally dancing around the center of somebody's vision with a damaging laser. And it was a scorched earth policy. You had to burn all of the blood vessels and you had to get them all or else they would come back. And of course, now you have a big black spot in your vision from where you lasered. So often the doctor wasn't very popular in those days because often he made the vision worse. And sometimes you had to sacrifice a little to preserve the rest. So it was not a perfect treatment. This picture here shows that treatment. So on the top left-hand corner, there's a little white spot. Those are the leaky blood vessels you saw in the earlier talk. And on the bottom right, it's all black, and that's because those blood vessels have been closed by the burning effect of the laser. But you also don't see in that spot anymore.
So now that we've moved forward from burning the retina, what happens next?
This isn't very fair. Those questions need to be longer. Okay. So we wanted to develop a treatment. When I say we, I mean the retina community. Wanted to develop a treatment that wasn't so damaging. And so the first treatment that came along was something called PDT. That stands for photodynamic therapy. And this was an innovative Canadian invention, actually, whereby you injected a special dye into a vein and you activated that dye in the back of the eye with a light. So this picture here is showing the delivery mechanism of putting this very specialized laser spot in the back of the eye and combining it with this dye, and the two of them together would close those blood vessels in the back of the eye without burning it. And this was a pretty interesting and major advancement at the time. Now, largely what it did was stop people from losing vision. It didn't necessarily make very many people better. It did make a few, but mostly it just stopped it from getting worse. But this was a big advancement because now we could actually slow things down rather than either giving up or burning it altogether.
So in the 90s we burned, and in the early 2000s we used photodynamic therapy. Then there was a big boom in the retina world with pharmaceutical advances and drugs, and it changed all of our delivery mechanisms away from the retina being lasered. And so can you tell us about these injections and which drug you think is the best?
Oh, okay, that's it. He's really putting me on the spot here. Okay. All right. So I think that the story actually goes back many years. The original people who were looking at trying to find a cure for cancer actually stumbled on this answer. So they wanted to find a way of stopping blood vessels from growing. There was a gentleman by the name of Judah Folkman in Boston who was doing the research on this. And they found, first of all, what it was that caused blood vessels to grow. And then ultimately, after another 20 years of research, they found what it took to stop those blood vessels from growing. And it didn't actually turn out to be that much of a cancer treatment, at least initially, but it went very quickly sideways into the major treatment now for macular degeneration all over the world. And this is something that has prevented vision loss and improved vision for probably millions of people around the globe, from an idea that started a long time ago in a different area of research. So I think that was kind of the interesting backstory. To get into the other question, which was, which drug is best, we're going to talk a little bit more about the types of medications here, but I'm just going to set things up with 3 here, and these are kind of the ones that we have in our hands, and they're not entirely in our hands, but I'll get to that. So the one on the left, ranibizumab, many of you know that as being Lucentis. That is the officially approved medicine for injecting into the eye for wet macular degeneration. Its cousin, which is the one on the right, called bevacizumab, that's the Avastin. So we had our hands on Avastin 2 years before we got the officially approved stuff. That's the difference sometimes between going through the regulatory process and not going through the regulatory process. But bevacizumab or Avastin wasn't originally approved. It was approved for cancer, not for eyes. But we knew that it worked, and we started using it, and it worked well, and that saved a lot of people before the regulatory process caught up. And now we have a third player, which is the one in the middle, called aflibercept, or also called VEGF trapped, also now called Eylea. That one is sort of the new kid on the block. It offers some differences between the other ones, and I'm not going to say which one is better, only that there is some people who respond to one of these drugs a little better than the others, and that's part of our job treating people, is to figure out which one maybe works a little bit better for some people than others. So I ducked the question.
The studies show that they're very similar in effectiveness. So there are other factors that come into play: cost and access and side effects and coverage, like our provincial healthcare system pays for Lucentis but does not cover Avastin or Eylea. So with respect to Lucentis, can you help us understand why it's so much better than the laser treatments that we used to do? What do the studies actually show?
So this graph helps to explain the first major trial that proved that this medication worked better than the existing treatments. So the bottom line there, that was the average of all of the people who got placebo. So over the course of this 2-year experiment, people lost roughly 3 lines of vision on the eye chart. So that's why it says 15 letters down at the bottom. So that's the equivalent of being able to going from reading and driving to not reading and driving. And that was the state of affairs before the injections came in. The top graph in the yellow and the orange were the people who did get the treatment. And this is, keep in mind, this is the grand average of all of the people in the study. So when the numbers go up like that, that means that some of these people did way, way better than that, and some people didn't improve much at all. But on average, most of those people actually improved about 6-7 letters on the eye chart. So that was the game breaker. That's why everything changed around to starting to do injections compared to our previous therapies. So they also compared that very same treatment to the PDT, that Visudyne treatment that we talked about earlier. And you can see that's the green line that goes down there a little bit. And you can see it didn't go down as far as the white line. So that was the previous best treatment. And as I mentioned, most people didn't get much better, but they stopped getting worse. That's about the fairest thing you could say about it. But this was clearly superior to that. So in a matter of a couple of years, everything switched around. We stopped doing all of those PDT treatments and switched around to doing injections very rapidly. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the new kid came on the block. This is the Eylea. And so the new standard of care became the Lucentis. That was what was being used all over the world. And this is a study that shows that those two drugs were very, very similar in their and how well they worked. Again, keeping in mind these are grand averages of hundreds of people. So this doesn't mean that any one person should expect that improvement when they get the injections. This was just hundreds of people averaged together, and when you took the average of all of those people and compared the two drugs, they were quite similar.
So, Jeff, there's 3 drugs, and some are really expensive and some are not expensive. So does cost play a role in our choice? What about, does one drug work better than another, or are they just the same?
So what I mentioned earlier, that we had Avastin in our hands a few years before the officially approved Lucentis. And because Avastin was originally a cancer drug, it didn't go through the regulatory process for eyes. That's a very expensive process. If you had the best new treatment in your hands and you wanted to prove to the world that this was going to change how we deliver treatments, you would actually have to have about $500 to $750 million in your pocket in order to go about proving with a huge study properly done with hundreds of people that that was actually the next best treatment. So when you do that, it ultimately makes the officially approved medication much more expensive. So now we had a situation where we had an officially approved medication that was expensive and a very inexpensive unapproved drug. And yet we knew that they worked. So the American government actually sponsored a study to compare the two head-to-head, because obviously the company wasn't going to do it. And so when they did that, this is the graph that they came up with, whereby the two medications were actually pretty similar. There were some small differences that keep all of us retina specialists arguing for days back and forth. But at the end of the day, the curves were similar enough to say that, yeah, both of these medications work very well, despite a big difference in the cost. Now, we don't like it when there's throwing cost considerations at us all the time. We prefer to try and just pick what's the right drug for you. But unfortunately, we live in the real world where things cost and some things don't, and we have to work within that system.
What about side effects? Is there a worry when you use these drugs? Does it cause problems when you inject? So are there local side effects, Jeff, when you inject it into the eyes? What about systemic side effects? Am I going to get a heart attack if you do this?
Most people do get a heart attack when you tell them you're going to inject something in their eye. So that's true. He set that up nicely. We work as a team. So there are two parts of that question. Well, first of all, are there local side effects? Well, anytime you put a needle in the eye, there's potential for problems. And of the various problems, the number one thing that we worry about is infection. It's very rare. It's on the order of about 1 in 6,000 to 1 in 10,000 in that range. But nevertheless, despite all our best efforts, it's going to happen. And it's a very serious and can be devastating complication. So we are very vigilant, and we do all the measures to try and prevent that from happening. So that's the local side effect that can be bad. But fortunately, it's quite rare. What made the story a little more interesting between these two medications, one that's approved and one that's not approved, is that there is a little bit of a difference, it seems, in the systemic effects. That is, if you start looking at older people and do they get heart attacks and strokes and other bad things like that happening with any difference whether they get the injection or not, the answer is yes, but not what we call statistically significant. So we have trouble proving it, but when you add it up, sometimes the people who get the Avastin seem to just get a few more problems. And this has been something that's been fairly consistent in all the studies. It's always a few more in every study, but it's never at the level at which the statisticians say, yep, there's a problem there for sure. It still could fall within the range of just luck or bad luck. But there's only so many times where you can just describe it to bad luck. So this graph here shows that there, over time, in that same study, when you compared those two medications, there was a little difference in that, what we call a safety profile and what we call a signal. You know, is there something that is really there, or is this just statistics and odds? And we're still working on that. We haven't got that totally sorted out. So when I said statistically significant, this graph looks at the comparing the two medications, and the center line is the line which you say there's absolutely no difference. And the little bars sort of say this is the range of error that we could define this study statistically as being yes or no to the question. And you can see that all of the bars cross the line. So it means that if any of those bars were completely to one side or the other and didn't touch the line, that would mean, okay, we've got something for sure that's statistically significant. But you can see that all of them basically touch or go through that line, which means that yeah, there's differences, but we can't prove it.
So it seems that the likelihood of me getting a heart attack is similar whether you use Avastin or otherwise.
Yeah.
What's next? What's going to happen ahead of us? Are there new drugs? Is there anything new coming down the pipeline that you could teach us about?
So most of what we've been talking about here today in terms of our treatments is when we say stop the development of CNVM, or that's medical lease for those growing blood vessels in the back of the eye. That's kind of where we've had some success now with these injections, is we can stop growing blood vessels. Yes, it might take numerous injections to do that, and you might have to do it on an ongoing basis, which can be frustrating, but at least we got that under control. However, we don't always have the ability to reverse some of the damage that has come. That is an area of research. And the biggest problem is that scar. Many of you saw those pictures of the white scar in the back of the eye. We want to stop that, or if that were to get started, is there a way of controlling that scar or preventing its formation? So that's kind of the next step in our research areas of interest. So this is where things are going to start to go, is that you stop the growth of the blood vessel. Okay, let's stop the scarring too.
One of the challenges for good outcomes is cicatrization or scarring. So when patients with wet macular degeneration develop blood vessels, bleeding, swelling, the treatment really helps shrivel that down and prevent scarring. Is there any new medications that might help reduce the scarring?
The answer is yes. And so that's as I mentioned, our next area of research. Before I just go there, though, I'm going to jump one slide back here, and that is that we are now starting to see the success of the treatments, so that over time we are now reducing the frequency of legal blindness and blindness in people with wet macular degeneration. So that number that was previously constantly climbing is actually now going down, and that's very gratifying to see. So that was the point of this slide. As we mentioned, we don't have the scarring process under control. So these are some new medications that I've just put the names up because we don't have a lot of data on them yet, but to introduce the idea that we're going to start now looking at different ways of stopping the blood vessels from growing. One of them is something called Combercept. This was actually invented in China. It may reach North American shores in a few years. That will be interesting. It has to go through the regulatory process. Another one called Fovista. We're very close on this one. We're beginning a research trial very shortly here in Calgary, looking at combining this treatment with Lucentis to try and stop the early development of scarring. So if we can stop the blood vessels quickly and stop the scarring process quickly, can we get a better result in vision? And so this will take, of course, time and the research to go about, and volunteers. Many of them will be patients like you who have a similar problem, who are just starting their first treatments, and they might be candidates, and they will perhaps volunteer their time along with us to try and prove, is this something that is worthwhile or not? And then perhaps next year we may see something called DARPin. It's, again, another mechanism of treating the blood vessels, and maybe that will have a slight difference from the other ones that we've been using. And again, this will take time and years to compare them.
That's great news that there's new frontiers in wet macular degeneration. But the most common macular degeneration is dry macular degeneration, and that affects 85% of the patients. Is there anything coming for dry macular degeneration and the progression of atrophy? So this is labeled sort of the near future therapies for dry macular degeneration, and by near I mean, again, the research trials will hopefully be starting in the next year or two.
Lampalizumab, which is a tongue twister, is designed to inhibit a portion of your complement system, which is a part of your immune system, which seems to have a relationship to dry macular degeneration. And again, this came from very basic science research that took a long time to figure out. This is an injection in the eye. It would have to be done every month. And the hope is that it would slow down the dry form of macular degeneration. I talked earlier about how it seemed to be sort of relentless and everybody's vision got a little worse and there wasn't anything you could do about it. Well, this will probably take a couple of years to just do the research trial on this before we know the answer, but yes. Amoxicillin is another one. That will be an oral medication. I don't know of a research trial starting in Calgary just on that yet, but the lampalizumab we hope to be starting sometime in the new year.
One thing that might be interesting to comment on, Jeff, is are there any eye drops that help macular degeneration? Could these medications be put into an eye drop so that we don't have to stick a needle in patients' eyes? And then what about targeting the immune system, the inflammatory cascade, to help this condition?
So now we're talking about future therapies that are probably a little bit further away from being in a research trial, perhaps say in Calgary, in an earlier phase of study. So the ones that are listed on this slide we may or may never see, because they're at the stage where they're still trying to figure out, first of all, is it safe? And secondly, does it even work at all? And then thirdly, is it work well enough to actually commercialize it and produce it in large quantities and put it in our hands? So all of the things here I'm not going to go through just because there's so many of them, and some of them may turn out and may not turn out. But the answer to the other question was, are there going to be an eye drop? Well, as a matter of fact, there is an eye drop under development. Again, it's at that very early stage where they're just trying to figure out, does it work well enough to take it to the next level and spend $750 million to prove that it actually works.
What about sight restoration and gene therapy? Is there anything positive there that might be helpful for our crowd?
So listed here are some of the things that are still further away. You're going to hear more from Dr. Pat Weiss today about gene therapy, and he knows a lot more about it than I do. I think that it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with gene therapies and stem cell therapies, because they offer a lot of hope and a lot of promise, and I think that it's something that we're definitely wanting to explore, but we're still, again, at an early stage trying to figure those out. Also listed on this slide is what about our current therapies? Is there perhaps a way of extending the treatment so that you don't have to have an injection every month? Could you have one every 3 months or every 6 months? And that's an area that I think that we will probably see probably in the next few years, where we'll get to the point where we'll have something that lasts a little longer. In fact, the Eylea drug mentioned earlier would probably be the first step towards something a little that lasts a little bit longer once that's approved actually in our hands. And then finally, the eye drops. So we might have the ability to put an injection in the eye and put you on eye drops and go 3 months and those kinds of treatments before we get to the point where we're actually trying to restore therapy with stem cells or with gene therapy.
We've sure come a long way, Jeff, from burning the retina. What about future therapies in dry AMD and the thinking around next steps there?
So if you go to a website called clinicaltrials.gov, you can actually get a listing of the various things that are under development. And this is just a list of the things that you'll find, not all of them by any means, but some of the more interesting ones. So some of them involve brand new therapies. Some of them involve existing therapies used in new or more long-lasting ways. And all of them are going to be under study in the next few years, and we will try and keep on top of this and see how these play out in terms of whether they can translate into treatments for our patients or not.
Thank you very much for doing that. We're happy to take questions and answer any areas of interest for you.
Thank you very much. I want to know, so can I develop a resistance to those anti-VEGF medication? I seem to have to. I was a year on Avastin responding, then stopped responding. I did a year on Lucentis and then stopped responding. I have been 3 months now on Alia, and I am not responding and getting worse. So what am I expecting next month?
Yeah, great questions. There is something called tachyphylaxis, or sort of a drug resistance that is sometimes discussed in these injectable agents. We're not sure if that's real in these protein monoclonal antibodies that are injected, whether you're actually becoming resistant to the drug, or is it your disease that's just continuing to progress. And we believe these medications have tremendously helped slow the disease down, but unfortunately they haven't cured the disease. So it's very hard for us to predict what to expect for you in the future, but thankfully these medications have offered some positive benefit in slowing down the disease for many of our patients. Not all. Some people don't respond to it, but most do.
There's a wealth of data available from all your patients and your peer group. You talked about the small number of practicing retinal specialists.
Yeah.
Can you instill confidence in how you're collecting all this data and what all your peers are made to do to submit all that data to the system and make advances through that data collection?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that the Canadian retina specialists group is a pretty cohesive bunch, and so we are together on a lot of these things, both in terms of participating in clinical trials and keeping track of our patients and the interesting things that happen to them. And it's not happening just yet, but in the not too distant future there will be an Alberta database that actually follows and tracks all of the patients that are getting this. So again, we're going to be looking at that safety question over time, because that's one that takes a lot of work to tease out. But also just, how well are we doing? Is there a way that we could be doing this that's better? So yes, that is something that is in the works.
Maybe I could just add to that. Sure, just hang on one second. I think Dr. Williams' comment about collating databases is starting to evolve, and this is hard to do, but once the province becomes one electronic chart so that we can merge information and learn from those collective databases, that will make that task easier, but that will take a little time.
Once you start receiving injections, is it likely that you must continue for the rest of your life? And if not, what would be the reason that you would stop receiving injections?
Yeah, great question. So when you start taking an injection, do you continue forever? Maybe the short answer is yes. But we generally have evolved 3 treatment strategies for our patients. Some patients need the injection every month. If we don't give it to them every month, the fluid or swelling or bleeding continues to remain active. The fire keeps burning. In other patients, we are able to control the fire and reduce it to a kindle. And in those patients, we can start to stretch the injections out. So instead of giving it to them in a fixed monthly interval, we can extend it out to maybe 6 weeks, 2 months, 10 weeks. And we try and push it as much as we can to minimize the risk of injections. And there are a few patients in whom we use an as-needed strategy. And that is, when they have swelling, we initiate treatments, and when the swelling and bleeding go away, we stop and treat them as needed. Generally, we don't stop patients receiving injections if they have good vision, because our goal is to try and preserve that good vision. We would sometimes stop injecting if the vision is already damaged due to scarring and atrophy, and the risk of the needle is too high now. I didn't quite hear, but I think you're asking, do computers make the disease worse to the disease process? Not to our knowledge. I don't think that the light or effects of the computer are damaging to the retina in making the macular degeneration worse. Smoking is, though.
Every day
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because I think everybody who gets injections experiences a little fluctuation all the time, and you want to know how bad does it have to be before I pull the alarm bells. And so the answer to that question, I think, is that when you actually are having a problem, the vision is getting a little worse and a little worse and a little worse every day. And most of the time, a day or 2 or 3 or 4 in that range, if it's a little worse, a little worse, you're not going to lose the whole ball game by 2 or 3 or 4 days. And so if there's a consistent change over that period of time, then you pull the alarm bell. If it's bad one day and then, got a little better again, I can read, okay, restart the clock and you don't worry about it and carry on, and because you can expect those fluctuations, and you're right, it does, depending on lighting condition and sometimes just the mood. So thanks.
This is, I have a personal question. I've had macular degeneration since the late 80s or early 90s. I went through the laser treatment and that horrible drink we used to take to improve the laser treatment. I now have lost most, if not all, of my central vision. I presume that there's nothing that can be done for my eyes at this time. Is that correct or not?
For the eyes, yes, that's correct. But I think that we would encourage people like yourself and anybody else in that situation to continue to deal with organizations like the CNIB and look at magnifying aids and the various things that they offer, because there are ways of using the sight that you do have, the peripheral vision and so forth, to try and deal with the day-to-day things. And that's their area of specialty. So yes, you can lose the center vision and we can't do anything for you, but there's organizations and people that can certainly help you along the way, like the CNIB.
I can see it was to some degree out of my peripheral vision.
Yeah.
But it also is weakening. Is that a part of macular degeneration?
Unfortunately, it's part of macular degeneration and the aging changes that go on in the eye, yes. But fortunately, we think that's still going to be slow.
Thank you, Dr. Williams and Dr. Kherani.